So this video is a continuation from yesterday's video where I'm basically discussing what various people have said in terms of Jack and Lily potentially wandering off or potentially ending up in the woods. Yesterday I focused mainly on Malaya and Janie. So what Malaya said in her media interview, the one single one that she did, and several of the statements that were made by Janie. I also touched a little bit on Daniel's perspective, but that's going to be where I start at this video. So first of all, in terms of Janie, again we heard that contradiction. The first place I thought to look was in the woods, but then she keeps hammering down on they'd never go through the woods on their own. But what I pointed out in yesterday's video was the wordage. When she talks about the fort, they're going up into the woods where the fort is. But the times where she says they wouldn't go through the woods, she's saying through the woods. She's talking about two different concepts here. So she tries to sell us on the idea that they'll only go up to the fort with her grandchildren because Lily doesn't like bugs and Jack doesn't like going through the woods. But we know from Belinda, when Belinda turned up to search and she said to Malaya, you know your children, where do they like to go? And Malaya said they usually go up and play in the fort up in the woods. There was also a lot of leakage from Janie, and also a few attempts to gaslight her audience into accepting her point of view. So, can you imagine a 6 and a 4-year-old going through the woods? Or, they've never done this before, why would they do it Friday morning? So my biggest takeaway from what Janie was saying is that she was very carefully twisting the truth, and I actually got the impression that it was not uncommon for Lily and Jack to go up to that little fort up in the woods. But that, on the other hand, they didn't like going for walks through the woods. So the only time they liked going into the woods was if they went to the fort. They didn't like going through the woods, beyond the fort, or going for walks. In terms of Malaya, I looked at the part where she's trying to convince the audience that there's always someone outside with the children, and discussed that and pointed out that actually that's a load of BS. Malaya was lying, even just because you could tell from the way she couldn't get a straight sentence out saying that. So it was a really bizarre way of saying it. And of course we know from what we've heard from Janie, and I know Janie's not always credible, but if you take your time to pull it apart and really have a look at it, you can start to understand where at least part of the truth lies. I also played that odd statement from Malaya where she spoke about how it had rained and that the children were probably soaking wet, but that because it had been sunny, she was hoping that they would be warm. Not hoping that they would have dried out, but hoping that they would have been warm. It was a very, very odd statement, and I think there was leakage in there in her basically, instead of running with what she was actually saying and hoping that they'd managed to get dry and warm perhaps, that her big focus there was warm, and she swallowed before she even said warm. She was having trouble getting that word out. The other big red flag that I played from Malaya yesterday was the one where she was talking about it being one of the worst nights, the night before she did that interview. Well, it should have been the worst night, because allegedly her children went missing on Friday morning. I think we can be pretty certain that whatever happened occurred Thursday evening. So it makes sense in terms of her saying one of the worst nights, but it's certainly a red flag. The other thing I pointed out, which I thought was significant, was her talking about not having them in their beds. And I pointed out that in that 2-page statement that she wrote, that appeared again on the 4th line. So it was one of the first things that was coming to mind for her, the thought of them not being in their beds. And in terms of that initial interview on day 2, with her being so concerned about them not being in her beds, you never heard her say that she was worried about them being hungry or thirsty or cold. You never heard her express concerns over them being outside in the dark, or that maybe they might have hurt themselves. The biggest thing, the thing at the forefront of her mind, was them not being in their beds. And I think that's significant. Now, the sliding door. She put forward the notion of they must have gone out the sliding door. We don't hear it when it opens. They usually don't close the sliding door. The really significant thing for me was that she said that they happened to get out that sliding door. By saying that rather than the sliding door, she's establishing that there is more to the story there. There's a backstory about that sliding door. She's also establishing that there is some sort of negative feelings there. Now, I just need to clarify something with that, because someone made a comment in my video yesterday. Well, of course she's going to say that sliding door, because all of the debate on social media about the sliding door. That's not actually the situation. Malaya did this interview on the Saturday. Her interview was actually the first time the public heard any information about the sliding door. The debate about the sliding door actually arose as a result of her comments relating to it, because people did see the red flags in what she said. So given that this is the first time the public heard anything about that sliding door, no, her referring to it as that sliding door has got nothing to do with the public debate over the sliding door. It is over the door being some sort of bone of contention in that household. And we know that. We've heard it directly from Daniel. I played that part of his interview with the turkey guy where he said they just need to work at closing it. That was, for starters, extremely passive-aggressive, but it was indicating that it was an issue. They just need to do that. That's you showing that you are annoyed at this thing. You are showing that you are considering their inability to do it as an inadequacy. We've heard so much from Daniel and Janie that points directly to Daniel undermining Malaya's confidence and her thoughts on how she is as a parent, her confidence in her parenting, just undermining everything about Malaya. So this comment from him, they just need to work on closing it, you can bet that was an ongoing issue in the household. And it was probably one of the things that was used to make Malaya feel super inadequate as a parent. You can't even get your children to shut this door. In this type of coercive relationship, everything that these children did wrong would have been put back on Malaya. This is evidence of you being a bad mother. So when we hear the way Daniel is talking about them just needing to close that door, that makes sense in terms of why Malaya is referring to it as that sliding door. Now there's a lot more that I covered in yesterday's video. That's just the bare bones. And there's a few things that I'll touch on a little bit more in this video. So on that note, let's just jump straight in.
And I know the RCMP and major crimes are working around the clock trying to piece everything together, and I'm grateful for that. But it always leaves the question, 6 weeks has gone by, And we know at this point they're not in the woods. And where are they?
So you can see, once again, we get one of those backhanded compliments from him relating to the RCMP. And this has been something he's been doing from really early days. On one hand, he offers a compliment and then turns around and whacks them on the head. So, you know, they're working around the clock trying to piece everything together, and I'm grateful. But it always leaves the question. He's inferring here that they should have had this solved by now after 6 weeks. This, of course, is an attempted deflection. Don't look at me, look at RCMP. I'm saying here that I'm so unhappy with the RCMP because they haven't solved the case. He's trying to give the impression he wants the case solved. Because, of course, if you want the case solved, you must be innocent. But the inflections here in his language are all wrong. 6 weeks later, or 6 weeks has gone by, and we know at this point they're not in the woods, and where are they? The where are they isn't raised as a question. It's just very flat, it's just a line. If you hadn't have heard the word where, then it wouldn't sound like a question at all. This is a statement that he's worked out in his head beforehand, but he's failed on the delivery because he hasn't delivered it like natural speech. He probably thought it sounded good in his head, but the where are they doesn't sound like a question at all. And the fact that it doesn't come across as a question shows us that there's no curiosity here. He's not concerned about finding out where they are. And in my opinion, that's because he knows exactly where they are. But this is also the point where he starts pushing the narrative of, we know they're not in the woods. But the thing is, when it comes to missing children, and you don't have any obvious clues, then you can't rule out 100% that they're not in the woods. Unless, apparently, if you are Daniel Martel. Because amongst his many super skills, he apparently can scan the entirety of the woods and be certain that Lily and Jack aren't in the woods. Or perhaps more likely, the reason he's so certain they're not in the woods, like I said, is because he knows where they are.
Why do you think that they're not possibly, why that they didn't possibly wander into the woods?
Well, with the amount of resources that were used, and I mean, for everything from drones to helicopters to classified technology and all the searchers on the ground, I mean, searchers on bicycles, they did everything. On the pipeline, they took in ATVs and Argos and side-by-sides. They used everything they could.
Now, Janie did a much better job than Daniel of addressing the question of, why don't you think the children are in the woods? He's completely gone off on a tangent. He has avoided saying anything relating to why the children themselves would not have wandered off into the woods. He's not negating the possibility of them wandering off into the woods. He's just saying, oh, nobody found anything. They had all this technology and nobody saw a thing. But he doesn't connect it with her question of, why do you think they didn't possibly wander off into the woods? And here's the thing. If he was innocent, then one of the things that would have been explained to him around the time when they wound back the search would have been the fact that when it comes to very little children like this, unless you are in exactly the right spot, you could miss them. If they get themselves into a hollow log, squeeze themselves into there because they're cold or wet, searchers could walk straight past them. He would have had these things explained to him. The technology is only efficient to a point. The dogs are only efficient to a point. If you are using infrared sensors with drones and the children have been gone for more than 12 hours, then you're probably not likely to get a heat source. You may get a heat source if, for example, there's an area where the ground has been disturbed and there is a difference in soil temperature, but you are not going to get a heat source from bodies after 12 hours, not of children. In terms of bloodhounds, it's my understanding that they only had 2 bloodhounds there at the search. They can't cover the entire 8-kilometre radius around the house. They were using them to check areas of interest. So when they found the piece of blanket, one of the dog handlers went in and he covered that area. He spent something like 6 hours with the dog tracking that area to see if they could pick up a scent. Yes, bloodhounds have incredible senses of smell. But if they're not in the right area, they're no good. So Daniel's confidence that at this point we know they're not in the woods is false confidence. Or it is confidence born of a knowledge of exactly where they are. It is actually quite likely, given that it's 6 weeks in, that he's had multiple interviews with RCMP and they've probably said outright to him, we know they're not in the woods. We know they didn't wander off into the woods. And he thinks that's a good argument for him to use without thinking it through and realising that the reason they're saying that to him is because they're putting it back on him. We know they didn't go into the woods. We know they're not in the woods. Tell us what you did with them. But like I said, his argument over why he doesn't think that they were in the woods or that they wandered into the woods doesn't connect with Jack and Lily at all. He doesn't use Janie's argument of Jack doesn't like to go through the woods on his own, or Lily's afraid of bugs, or they only like going up as far as the fort. He doesn't use any of those arguments. And why is that? Because he hasn't spent the last 6 weeks racking his brain over what happened to these children and thinking of different scenarios. None of these people have. That is why you get them sticking to the one narrative. Because they're not sitting there like we are doing and going through the many different scenarios over what might have happened. They are just pushing hard with they're abducted narrative. And now Daniel seems to have thrown all caution to the wind and wants people to believe him that this is all going back to Malaya. She organised for someone to take the children and hide them. If he knew nothing about what happened to the children, his certainty over we know they're not in the woods wouldn't come from this big long spiel about the search. It would come from a knowledge of the children, and he never expresses anything along those lines.
I run up into the woods where the cabins are and look in the cabins, look around the area, didn't see them. I'm screaming and yelling, Lily and Jack, Lily and Jack, Lily and Jack.
Now, I'm going to double back to this a little way down the track, but he's talking about, when we first realised they were missing, he ran up into the woods where the cabins are. And I still find it odd that he kept referring to cabins. And my concern with that is because of Janie talking about how she told the RCMP, you don't need to search this community hall or the camp nearby, and she started slipping and saying cabin. And I can't help thinking that maybe on day one, evidence was hidden in that cabin next to their property. I don't believe the children were. I think whatever was done with them occurred overnight. But given that Daniel was making 5 trips, there's a lot of something that he had to remove from that property. And we had Janie refusing to allow them to search her RV. They didn't get into that. The RCMP didn't get into that until the Sunday, 2 days after the children were reported missing. The thing that catches my attention here, though, is he's saying he ran up into the woods where the cabins are and he didn't see them. When you say you didn't see someone or something, that actually suggests that that person or that thing was there, but you just didn't see it. He didn't say he ran up to the woods, but they weren't there. He says he ran up there, but he didn't see them. Now, this might get me into trouble with a few people, but have you ever used the term or the response to someone, did you have a girl look or a boy look? In response to they've gone to look for something and they come back and they're like, it's not there, I can't see it. And then you go and you move one item and bang, there it is. So Daniel saying he didn't see them doesn't necessarily mean they weren't up there, it just means that he didn't see them. He hasn't clarified if him not seeing them meant that they weren't up there. He's just saying he ran up there and he didn't see them. Bear with me on this one. I will come back. I will double back to this later on. He also talks about running through the woods, yelling their names. Lily and Jack, Lily and Jack. This also ties in with that early comment that he made where he said, where he was yelling till his throat went hoarse or something like that. If we strip the narrative away from that, what he's telling us is that around the time that Lily and Jack allegedly went missing, you may have heard him yelling. And I'm going to double back to that also.
I believe the exact same as RCMP do. They didn't go into the woods.
Now, RCMP haven't publicly come out and stated that they don't believe the children wandered off into the woods. So this statement from Daniel certainly ties in with what I just said a little bit earlier in terms of 6 weeks in, and he's saying, we know they're not in the woods, but where are they? He didn't even say where, he said, and where are they? To me, putting those two statements together, that tells me that probably one of the main questions that is being asked of Daniel every time he goes in for an interview is, we know the children didn't go into the woods. We know the children weren't abducted. Where are they? We've heard so many instances where Daniel has heard something that's been said by media or by a YouTuber, and he's added it to his own narrative because he's decided, well, that's good. That's a good part to add to my narrative. He's continuously adapted over the last 6 months from listening to all the media, from listening to YouTube, taking on board what's being said, adapting his behaviours, adapting his statements, his speech, and like I just said, taking on board things that other people have said because he thinks that statement supports his narrative. And he doesn't really think it through in terms of what it's really saying. So in terms of saying, I believe the same as the RCMP, they didn't go into the woods, that's technically not right. Because he's pushing this abduction narrative. More to the point, he's pushing this Malaya orchestrated an abduction narrative, which is not what the RCMP believe. But he's latched on to them saying to him, we know the children didn't go into the woods. And saying, well, okay, now the RCMP have said that, I can say that I'm in agreement with the RCMP. So essentially he's twisting the questions they posed to him and using them to prop up his own narrative. Now, the other thing we saw with this Turkey interview was a bit of a change in tactics from Daniel. Up until this point, he never outwardly lied about things. He inferred things. He gave you half a story so that you would go the rest of the way on your own. Or he simply changed the topic and avoided answering the question. But then suddenly, in this Turkey interview, I'm not sure if he was having a bit of a mathematician moment, if he had maybe been entertaining himself prior to this interview. Because in this interview, he's coming out with these bold-faced lies. Not only that, you can see that in some instances, he's quite delighted with his own stories. I did a video a few weeks ago where I spoke about the story that Daniel made up on the DT channel about a second pink blanket and how he was so elaborate with that story. Elaborate to the point where you're like, why are you going into so much detail? Why are you being so elaborate? And because this was the first time we'd heard anything of there being 2 pink blankets, because of that, I emailed the RCMP and questioned that. I said, look, this bit of information has come out now. There is a claim that there was a second pink blanket found. And they clarified that in an email saying, actually, no. 1 blanket, 2 pieces of 1 blanket. So in this interview, it seemed like Daniel was just really enjoying making up new stories. Like I said, Daniel adapts. He listens to everything. He pays attention to what's being said, how it's being said. And I believe, given that he's now running with Dingbat's story, I believe he has looked at the way Dingbat has gone on people's channels, looked at the way the guy has just come out with these bold-faced lies and super creative stories, and Daniel's gone, oh wow, I can do that. Which is why we get that elaborate story about the blanket. He's decided to follow Dingbat's example and start making it up completely. And you're going to see that in this next statement from him. In this next statement, the goal for him is to sell the story about Malaya getting someone to pick up the kids, about her hiding the kids somewhere. So take a listen.
They didn't get lost in the woods, and I'm going to be the first one to ever say that. I don't think they're in the woods whatsoever. I don't think they ever were. And I feel like a dummy for wasting the first day and a half searching my ass off for then my family and friends to sit down and sit me down and say to me, Daniel, we don't think they're in the woods. And then with all the resources poured in and all the searchers' time, and they got injuries, and the amount of helicopters and drones, dogs, the classified technology like the satellites, they didn't find anything.
So I want to point out first the lightning lizard lips that we just saw. Just before he said they didn't find anything, that tongue shot out and shot back so fast that if you blinked you would have missed it. He was thoroughly enjoying himself in this interview. He was holding court with someone who he believed was on his side, was prompting him to help him make sure that he gave the right answers, and was listening to what he was saying and agreeing with what he was saying, and in some instances telling him what he should say beforehand. Now, I think that first little paragraph that he said is something he rehearsed in his head, because the intonation is wrong. He says, they didn't get lost in the woods, and I'm going to be the first person, or the first one ever, to say that. Like, seriously, what was this guy on when he was doing this interview? Because we've been all saying that for the last 6 months. And in fact, quite early on in the piece, we had that interview 6 weeks in, where he said, oh, we know they're not in the woods, and where are they? But in this interview, he thought that sounded good. I actually think that statement where he said, and I'm going to be the first one to say that, like I said, the intonation is wrong. I think that was meant to be attached to the second half of that little paragraph. But in his brain, he's just trying to get the words out, and it's lost actual meaning. The intonation doesn't match, so he's telling us instead that he's the first person to say they never got lost in the woods. Well, seriously, 6 months in, or 5 months in, I think this was, you were not the first person to say that. And you know you were not the first person to say that. But you get the follow-up statement, which I think is what he was trying to attach to the I'm going to be the first person to say this thing, because he says, I don't think they ever were. This is the first time that any of the players in this have actually come out with that bold-faced statement of, I don't think they were ever in the woods. So I guess in a way he maybe is the first one to say that amongst all the people involved in the case. But what is significant here is the fact that he is making that differentiation. He's saying, I don't think they are in the woods. In fact, I don't think they ever were in the woods. What he hasn't realised is that he's just been seriously over-explaining this. And by adding that on the end, it makes him look even more guilty. Now, if nothing nefarious happened, then the statement, I don't believe they're in the woods, or I don't think they're in the woods, stands alone. It doesn't need further clarification, because it's saying the day that they went missing, something else happened other than them going into the woods. I don't believe that's where they are. But what he's done is he's basically made it, he's crapped on himself, basically. He said, I don't believe they ever were. By saying, I don't believe they ever were, what he's just done is a bit of a disaster for him, really, because he's basically said that there is a possibility that maybe they were originally in the woods and then someone took them out. By saying, I don't believe they ever were, is essentially saying, I believe that while there is a possibility that maybe they were in the woods and then someone moved them, I'm going to say no to that. Essentially offering these two statements side by side is saying that they can exist separately. You can have them not being in the woods separate from them having never been in the woods. The first one could be, I don't believe they're in the woods, but they were before. They were originally. The second one is, they were never in the woods at all. I think this is leakage. And what's really interesting is that before he says, I don't think they ever were, you get the lizard lips happening, which is a classic tell from Daniel. It's that neon sign that says, what I'm about to say is deceptive. Makes me think that at some point in time, Lily and Jack were in the woods. And then we get this complete fabrication from him that is totally illogical, totally ridiculous, and a load of BS. So supposedly, there were only 3 people on the property when the children went missing. And yet Daniel's claiming that his friends and families pulled him aside and said, we think they're not in the woods. Well, the only person that could possibly have any idea along that track is Janie. Janie, who by her own admission, as soon as she heard from Malaya the children were missing, went straight up into the woods to search around the little camp area that the kids have. So why would anybody in his little group of family and friends have any reason to believe the children hadn't wandered off into the woods? Or perhaps more specifically, given that Daniel felt the need to differentiate, they thought the children weren't in the woods. Now, like I said, the only person that could possibly think that something different happened based on observations is Janie. But according to her and Justin went back out searching on the Saturday evening after everybody left. Well, that's one version anyway. Not only that, but Daniel told the media at the end of May that him and his family were still going out searching of an evening. But let's apply a little bit of logic here. What he's saying is that they've said this less than 48 hours after the children have been reported missing. During that crucial period when, if the children are out there in the woods, time is of the essence. So you are going to gamble with the lives of children based on I think they're not in the woods. Would you really want to be that person that said to a parent, I don't think your child's in the woods. Don't bother searching. You're just a moron for actually spending 2 days searching. Who's going to do that? But putting all that aside, you mean to tell me that within less than 2 days of the children going missing, suddenly your family's got a hunch or we think that the children aren't in the woods? Based on what? If it's solid enough for them to say, we think the children aren't in the woods, it would have to be solid enough to actually tip off the RCMP. Meaning that the RCMP would suddenly focus in that direction. Now, we don't know exactly what's been going on with the RCMP investigation, but we know they kept searching up until the 8th of May. 6 days, and then they called off the search. But then they sent searchers back out on the 17th, and again on the 30th. And then in October, they took dogs in. So apparently, Daniel's family saw clues that the children weren't in the woods, but they never told the RCMP about it. They're not now trying to claim the $150,000 reward based on some knowledge that they have. We know that what Daniel is doing here is he's trying Janie's strategy of giving his audience a little bit of information and hoping they'll run with it. He wants his audience to believe that even his family knew that this claim that Durwood is making was real. He knows he can't make direct accusations against Malaya. That's going to end badly for him. So instead, he knows that those accusations are out there, and he's just pushing his audience in that direction. But here's what makes this super amusing. He's trying to get his audience to go down the rabbit hole that Dingbat dug. He wants them to follow the story of Malaya put the kids in a car and they're hidden somewhere. But he's so in love with his story of pushing it like, well, you know, all the resources, the time, the injuries, the technology. He's used this up until now as his reasoning for why the children aren't in the woods. But if you listen to what he's saying, he's now trying to use it as his way of saying this is why he felt like such a dummy, because they went to these lengths. But clearly partway through saying that, because it's something he's rehearsed so much, instead of finishing off with the qualifier, and I feel bad that they went through that, instead he finishes off with, they didn't find anything. So he's tried to use this well-rehearsed argument to prove a new story, but he's fallen flat on his face because at the end of it, he reverted back to his original story.
So what does this tell you now that the cadaver dogs were in, they didn't find anything? Do you think like the part on the woods, do you think that's case closed?
It should be case closed. It should have been case closed from the very start, because with the amount of resources and technology and amount of searchers and everyone deployed in that the initial search, that was a lot. That was an 8-kilometer radius outwards. And it's just the amount of money and people's time, injuries that were sustained during that. It's just, people should have just opened their eyes to see that we need to look elsewhere. I pointed many fingers, and I think that's where the people should look.
So I just want to remind you that the next CBC interview that was done with Daniel was done over the phone. And I can understand why. Because the guy just makes your skin crawl. Statements like that. She's like, you know, now the dogs have been. Do you think that means that that part of the woods, the part with searching the woods, is case closed now? And he goes, it should be case closed. It should have been case closed from the very start. And clearly his brain's not quite so fried when he's doing this interview, because he tries to use that argument of the resources, the technology, the money, and using it as he's essentially saying, look at all the wasted resources, the wasted money, the injuries that occurred, searching for children that weren't in the woods. Like I said, if you have information that is that solid that you can be super confident that they wasted their time searching, then you should have given that information to the RCMP, and this should all be resolved by now. But of course, this is nothing but a fabrication. And he's going a step further here. But he's not talking about the RCMP. He says people should have just opened their eyes to see that we need to look elsewhere. And then I pointed many fingers, and I think that's where people should look. This is nothing about the investigation. This is nothing about the RCMP. This is about all the people who are pointing out all the lies, all the inconsistencies, all the people who are pretty damn convinced that Daniel was involved in whatever happened to the children. That's who he is directing this at. He is essentially trying to say, I've told you the story that I want you to believe. I've worked my arse off for the last 6 months trying to convince all you people that Malaya's the one to blame here. And you need to pay attention to me saying this and go chase off after her and leave me alone. He's basically flipped the question of, should this chapter of the investigation be closed now, the searching in the woods? He's flipped that to saying, I want all these people online to leave me alone and start focusing on Malaya because I pointed at her so many times, and aren't you people paying attention?
Not here.
Not here. Not in the woods. The fingers have been pointed. Let's start taking a look.
So she asks him, not here. And he's like, no, not here, not in the woods. So he's still going with that, they're not in the woods. But of course the goal here is to hammer it in. They're not in the woods. I've pointed at Malaya so many times. That's where you need to start taking a look. He's pretty adamant that the children aren't in the woods. And I think when you couple that with his comment about the cadaver dogs when he said that he's 100% certain they're not going to find anything, he must have realised they weren't going to just search the property, but they would be searching in that radius around the property when he said he was 100% certain they wouldn't find anything. So I think him saying, not in the woods, is him basically telling the truth. And again, it makes me want to look on property belonging to people in his family, in any abandoned mines, particularly if there's any that look like they've recently been re-concreted up at the entrance, or in any waterways. Okay, I'm going to go off at a slight tangent now, away from the discussion of the children being in the woods, but I'll tie it all together at the end.
But that night, what time did you go to bed?
I went to bed actually a lot later than Malaya did, I think. Like Malaya was already asleep when I came into bed. I remember flicking on the light for the kids at 12 at night, or a little bit after 12, so a little bit after midnight, and both of the kids were fast asleep under the covers. So, but I never got a chance to see what clothing they were wearing because the blankets were up on them, right?
Did you see the backpack?
I don't remember the backpack, the strawberry backpack, but that was always in Lily's room, right?
Okay, we've all said this. On what planet would you go into the bedroom of a child when they are sleeping and turn on the light at midnight or just a bit after midnight? Nobody does that. But what is interesting here is exactly what he's telling us. First of all, he's really emphasising the midnight thing. He went in and flicked on the light at 12 at night, a little after 12. So a little bit after midnight. Why is he homing in on that time? Why is that such a significant time for him? His brain has stuck on that. His brain is fixated on that and can't go beyond that. That's a huge red flag to me, and that makes me think something significant occurred then. And it fits in, of course, with what we've heard from the neighbours. This car between midnight and 5 a.m. But what did he actually say here? I remember flicking on the light for the kids at 12 at night. First of all, he's telling us that he flicked on the light for the children. He's not saying he flicked on the light to check on them. He's telling us he flicked on the light for them, for their benefit. He was doing it for them. He was not flicking it on to check on them. And of course this doesn't fit with him then saying that they were fast asleep. Because how could he know that they needed him to turn the light on if they were fast asleep? So him saying he's flicking the light on for the kids is a little bit odd. He continues on to say, and both of the kids were fast asleep under the covers. But what's a huge red flag for me here is this, he says both of the kids were, and then he locks his lips. In fact, he almost swallows his lips before he goes on to say fast asleep under the covers. I think he saw the kids a little bit after 12. I believe he discovered a little bit after 12 that they were deceased. And this is why he stops and he literally swallows before saying fast asleep under the covers. His brain is pulling out all the stops to prevent him from making that lie. I mean, it could just be that the lie is them being fast asleep under the covers, given that he nearly swallowed his lips before he said that. But I'll come back and I'll unpack that a little bit more later on. The next thing he says, he gives himself away. He says the so, then there's a pause, and he says, but I never get a chance to see what clothing they were wearing because the blankets were up on them, right? First of all, let's talk about inappropriate use of tense. He says, I never get a chance to see what clothing they were wearing. He's changed tense through the sentence. I never get to do this. And then going to the past tense. So that says to me that this is just a load of BS. That straight out says that this is a made up part of the narrative. He's now telling a narrative because he's telling it as a story. And when you tell a story, you are telling it in present tense. Because you're not recalling something. You're not talking about something that happened, which you would be talking about in the past tense. You are talking about what you are making up right there on the spot. And he finishes with, because the blankets were up on them, right? And you get the lizard lips again straight after he says that. There's definitely deception going on here. But not only that, by throwing right at the end, that's his way of saying, you know this for a fact. It's his way of pushing his narrative onto the audience. You've already been told this, therefore, this is the truth. You know this, right? It's a persuasion technique. You know this. You might not actually know it, but he's going to tell you you know it, so that you believe him that you know it, and you don't question his story. It's a bit like Janie's Believe Me. Similar thing, but a bit more pointed. Essentially saying, you know this. If you can't actually access in your brain, it's just because you have forgotten this fact, which is truthful. And then he's asked about the backpack and he says, I don't remember it. And he makes sure he gives the description just to make sure that people know what it is he's talking about. Just to make sure that people are clear that he's trying to establish the backpack that is missing is what we are talking about. The description isn't necessary unless you are trying to manipulate your audience. So what does he say? He's like, I don't remember the backpack, the strawberry backpack. But that was always in Lily's room, right? So again, we have that persuasive right thrown into it. You know this. So it must be true. I didn't see it, but it had to have been there. And now something that a subscriber pointed out to me that he does, which I had noticed, I just hadn't really thought about it. When he says backpack, he draws it out. So it's backpack. Longer than the other words in his sentence. There is something about the backpack that is significant in his mind. There's a few important points that I'm skimming over here that I'm coming back to.
And then when my two oldest grandchildren would come down, every second weekend they would come. My oldest granddaughter would come in here and they'd say, Granny, we want some snacks to go up to the little cabin they built, or the little fort they built. They built it themselves out of sticks and brush. And I'd say, there's the fridge. My other two grandchildren, they could have whatever they wanted. My fridge was like one of those doors when you go into a store. It would open and close all the time. My oldest granddaughter would come in here and she would take snacks for all of them and pack them in her backpack and go up to the camp. And another thing, the backpack thing. I've never seen Lily outside with that backpack. Daniel told me that they always tried to keep her from taking it outside. But I've never seen her with that pack. The only time outside playing, but the time I did see her with the backpack is when my two other grandchildren would come down. She'd want a backpack too, because the oldest grandchild had a backpack and she wanted to be just like her and have a backpack.
First of all, I think Janie was really muddled in her head here about what exactly she was trying to convey. But what is interesting here is that she's offering up information. When someone offers up information like this, pay attention. Because this is not related to any of the questions that should have been asked, clearly. She talks about when her grandchildren are there and how her granddaughter has a backpack, goes into her RV, fills it up with snacks for all of the kids, and they go up and they have their snacks up at the cabin, or the fort, or whatever she's going to call it in that moment. And then she says something really telling. She says, and another thing, and goes on to talk about Lily's backpack. And I'll come back to why that is significant after I finish explaining this. So she starts to say that she's never seen Lily outside with that backpack. And she says, Daniel told me they always tried to keep her from taking it outside. But I've never seen her with that pack. So after establishing she's never seen Lily with that backpack, she's never seen her outside with it, she then turns around and says, but the time I did see her with the backpack is when my grandchildren, she fumbles around because she realises that she's excluding Jack and Lily the way she's saying it, so she says her two other grandchildren, is when they're there. And she'd want a backpack too because she looks up to this older girl and wanted to be just like her. So she has doubled down. She said, I've never seen her outside with the backpack. She said that twice. She's trying to emphasise that point. But then she also turns around and says, oh, I saw her with it when my granddaughter was here and Lily wanted to be like her and have a backpack to take up to the fort. So her story doesn't match here. But going back to the and another thing, she's tying all this in together and saying that it is significant that when her granddaughter's here, they'd all put snacks in a backpack and go up to the cabins. She tries to then argue away from that by saying she's never seen Lily with that backpack. But because she said and another thing, that's the linking them together, which to me suggests that she's fully aware that there have been times when Lily has perhaps filled up a backpack from the kitchen and gone up to have snacks with Jack up there, up in the woods, in the little cabin. Now, I think this is another instance of Janie accidentally going off script. Has she given away something that we weren't supposed to know? Listen to this particular audio.
Now, so you wake up because there's been some time that you guys haven't heard the kids anymore, correct?
I woke up when Malaya woke me up. I'm pretty sure it was her who woke me up because we both kind of like woke up at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember her saying, as it says in the documents, she said, "I don't hear them." But the craziest thing was when I woke up, it was in the first 5 seconds that she said, "I don't hear them." Okay. And usually you would have to wait a couple seconds, you know what I mean? Or like 30 seconds or something like that, because it could be in the fridge, because that's usually what everything goes quiet when they're, grabbing food or doing something, right?
Okay, for the purposes of this video, let's just ignore the fact that, again, he was trying to throw this all back onto Malaya and make her look guilty. What is significant here is the statement at the end of all this about how normally you would stop and listen for a while, because when it goes quiet, it usually means that they're grabbing food or doing something, right? Again, he wants agreement here. And this is one of those typical statements of every parent will tell you that when your kids go quiet, they're up to something. So that's what he's saying here. He's saying, Malaya responded straight away instead of listening to see if she could hear them at all. But, kids go quiet when they're up to something. And the up to something includes grabbing food. I've spoken about this before in terms of, I believe that they were not allowed free access to food. We saw that there was a lock on the fridge. We heard him mention that the stuff in the cupboards was high up so that they had to climb on a chair to get to it. And this reference here is basically your classic line of, the kids are up to something because it's gone quiet. But for Daniel, this involves them getting into the cupboards, taking food. This would also tie in with what he introduced quite early on, and that is the part of the narrative where he could hear Jack in the kitchen. I've mentioned this before. One of the things that Lily does a lot is that she models behaviours. So she loved wearing glasses and a hat when she was at Belinda's place, because that was what Belinda did. So Belinda had to pop the lenses out of a pair of glasses for her and give her one of her old hats. Lily liked cooking on the toy oven. That's that whole model behaviours again, seeing this is what you do when you're being domestic. And Janie is claiming Lily looked up to her granddaughter, and that when they went up to the fort, they would pack their backpack full of snacks from Janie's fridge, and go up and have a little feast up at the fort. Well, it was Friday, but apparently that was a weekend when Janie's grandchildren or Daniel's children weren't going to be there. They were there the weekend before. For the children, it was a weekend already because they weren't at school. Did they come home on Thursday and decide they were going to pack a little... Did Lily maybe decide that since Daniel's oldest daughter wasn't there to pack the snacks and take them up to the fort, that she might follow that lead and pack snacks in her backpack so that her and Jack could go up to the fort and have a little snack, a little feast? I'm just going to let that thought sit there for a moment and move on.
A lot of speculation is you killed the kids. We'll just come out and say it straight as it is.
What do you think when you read that?
It's a lot of nonsense, obviously. I know the truth. I didn't kill Lily and Jack.
So he's quite blunt there. I know the truth. I didn't do that thing to Lily and Jack. And as he says that, he raises one eyebrow. You've got the asymmetry going on here. This is something that really ticks him off. The notion that he directly caused Lily and Jack to not be alive. For us, it's really confrontational to hear someone say that so bluntly. And this actually isn't the only time that he says it.
I didn't do anything. I know Malaya didn't do anything. I know my mother didn't do anything. Those are 3 people on the property. I mean, after the polygraph exams, they should have known right there. We didn't kill any of the kids, or we didn't kill the kids.
I've broken that statement down before. There's a lot of red flags in that statement. But again, I just wanted to emphasise him being very blunt about apparently none of them are responsible for Lily and Jack becoming not alive. Not only that, he says, I didn't do anything, Malaya didn't do anything, my mother didn't do anything. The fact that Daniel could make these statements so boldly, without hesitation, to me gives an explanation as to why, when he did the polygraph exam, that he came up as being truthful for particular questions. Remember in his interview where he said that a lot of the questions were directed at, did you do that K thing to Jack and Lily? The fact that he can say this so boldly here says to me that, yes, he would have passed that part of the polygraph. The question is, does he believe this in his head, or is he just a really good liar? Okay, I'm going to just put that all off to the side for a moment and go off at another tangent.
I have 3 brothers. 4 brothers that live in this area plus myself. And we were all out looking. All of us, because we know these woods inside and out. And we knew where Jack and Lily would have been.
Janie leaked some truth here. She realised, as she was saying it, that she was saying something she shouldn't have said. And she tried to correct herself, but in the wrong way. In her panic, her brain just simply reworded it. She said, she's talking about her and her brothers, and she's like, we knew where Jack and Lily would be. And then pauses and would have been. Well, would be or would have been. Still, there's not a lot of difference in terms of translation, because she is talking about in the past when they were searching for the children. So grammatically, you could have said either one of those. At the time you were searching, we knew where they would be. Or, since you are speaking about an event that occurred in the past where they would have been. So in trying to correct herself, in trying to step away from admitting that she knew where they would have been, all she did was just reword what she was saying. She basically opened her mouth, pulled out one foot and shoved the other one in. Jane has told us here that she knew where the children were. The thing is, she repeatedly said they never would have gone through the woods. They would have only ever gone as far as the cabin in the woods, the fort in the woods. Is she telling us here that we knew that's where they would have been? Now, there is a subtle difference if you look at context. But I'm going to pause that and come back to it.
And Malaya said, should I call 911? And I said, well, just wait 1 second. I ran up in the woods to the kids. They have cabins up in the woods. It's about, I don't know, 100 feet up in the woods.
Again, leakage. I ran up in the woods to the kids and then quickly fixing it to they have cabins up in the woods. So even then, in trying to fix it, his brain still got paused, still didn't come up with a full sentence. And I pointed this out some time back, that he'd said this, and that it sounded to me like he was saying the kids were up in the fort. And at the time, I couldn't quite connect it all. Because if they were in the fort, how could both of them end up being not alive? And if it was an accident up at the fort, then why would you need to cover it up? I know this is over an hour, but I am pushing on. So I'm going to look at a few things in the documents, and then I'm going to finish off with a few other bits of information and draw it all together. So I have, first of all, Daniel's statement. Two things that stand out to me here is he went out and saw the back sliding door was closed. The kids didn't usually close it when they went outside. Two bits of information there. These are things we know. This is nothing new to you, nothing new to me. But he saw the back sliding door was closed. The kids didn't usually close it when they went outside. Come back to that. And then we have Daniel ran outside, but they were not in the yard and he couldn't see them. Remember earlier when he's talking about running up to the fort, he ran up, but he couldn't see them, or he didn't see them. Similar thing, similar wording. I just thought that was a bit interesting. Malaya's comment, which also we know, she did not think the kids had changed their clothes from the night before. So she's not saying she knows they didn't change their clothes from the night before. She's saying she didn't think they'd changed their clothes from the night before. But like she claimed that their clothes were, all their clean clothes were in bags still from going and doing her laundry. So there's something hinky here in terms of this story about what the children were wearing. And we have Lily's backpack was gone, so she assumed she had it with her. Lily and Jack's boots were gone. So she's not saying that she believes they were wearing them, they were just gone. Lily's backpack was gone, she must have had it with her. Then up the top you have her talking about them being hyper and excited, and she got them tucked into bed around 10 p.m. But she gets confused. She gives different times as to when the children went to bed. Daniel apparently has no idea when the children went to bed. She says Jack had his blanket and his dinosaur, and she shut his door, and then something else. Lily went to bed with her backpack. Malaya's the only one who has said specifically that Lily went to bed with her backpack. I'm going to talk more on that soon. This is still from Malaya, and she said that Daniel said they must have gotten out the back sliding door. This is because of him barricading, locking, or doing something to the front door to make it inoperable. There's several stories, so let's just not go down that road right now. And again, she says the same thing. The door was shut, but the kids would normally leave it open if they went outside because it was so heavy. So here she's at least excusing them. The door's really heavy. They struggle to close it. And then you have this afterthought, bit of a consolation. There are times when they would close it. Well, given that she said that the door was shut, then obviously you would presume there are times when they would close it. I would love to hear Malaya and Daniel's original interviews to find out how this particular bit of information came out. Because in terms of them getting out the sliding door, I'm wondering if detectives said, so when you got up, was the door open or closed? And the answer was closed. And then we have the problem there of, but they don't normally shut the door. So then the add-on at the end was, but there are times when they close it. I'm just wondering if this was a slip-up in their interviews, which may indicate that it wasn't the children who closed that door. And I'm not talking about abductions. And then we have Malaya said Lily and Jack did not normally wander on their own. They would if Daniel's children were there, but not by themselves. I guess going up to that fort probably doesn't classify as wandering, because she said to Belinda they like to go there quite frequently. But just hold on to that statement in your head, because when we look at the dispatch, she contradicts herself. And then she's talking about her conversation with Janie. Janie got ready and went to look for them. Janie told Malaya she heard them outside playing and Daniel yelling. Now, we heard a similar thing from Janie, and she says that she didn't think anything of it when Daniel was yelling. He could have been yelling for them to come inside, but she thought he was probably yelling at Jack for getting into something. Maybe he let the chickens out or did something like that. So Janie is essentially saying Daniel was yelling at them because they did something wrong. She's also showing us that it's so commonplace that she doesn't bat an eyelid when it happens. Janie's statement to the RCMP, Jack would not go for a walk on his own. It's not this notion of Jack and Lily wouldn't wander off somewhere together. She's saying Jack wouldn't go for a walk on his own. This is very different from the idea of Jack and Lily going off somewhere together. And you have Janie saying outright to the RCMP that she does not believe the kids are in the woods. Some of these things I'm just going to highlight now and then wrap it all together at the end. Now, here is a statement from Daniel. He didn't know what they were wearing because they were underneath the covers when he checked on them. Now, this is a statement that clearly he's thought about. It sounds normal. It doesn't sound slightly odd, like the statement that he said with the turkey guy, where he said that the blankets were up on them. Saying they were underneath the covers, that makes sense. When he checked on them. He's not saying here about flicking on the light or anything about that. He's just saying he checked on them after he came inside. So what Malaya said to dispatch, they may have left the residence and were missing. What do you mean may have left the residence? To me, the residence is the house, the inside of the house. If they're not in the house, then clearly they may have left. They have definitely left, not may have. That is someone avoiding something. That is someone skirting around the truth. Here, she's saying they were known to wander. Well, in her statement to the RCMP a few days later, she said they didn't wander. And then she makes this statement, their boots were gone. Well, if their boots are gone, would that mean that they definitely left the residence? Not may have left the residence? So even this, things aren't quite right with what Malaya said to dispatch when she first rang. Now, I want to come back to talking about the weather on the 1st and the 2nd of May, because I think this plays into what potentially could have occurred. So on Thursday, the maximum temperature was 11 degrees. And that's Celsius. Now, I can't think straight up what that translates to in Fahrenheit, other than damn cold. The minimum temperature, 2 degrees Celsius, which translates to even more damn cold. I know that would have to be less than 40 degrees Fahrenheit, quite a bit less. Not good with the translations though. Friday, 1 degree warmer through the day. It reached a top of 12 degrees. Whoa! Heat wave. And overnight, 1 degrees. Now, when you think about the way temperatures work, that 1 degrees overnight would have been overnight between Thursday and Friday, because it's in those earlier hours of the morning where you get the coldest temperature. So that says that basically the night, Thursday to Friday, would have been colder overnight than Wednesday through to Thursday. So this is a temperate climate heading towards summer, but it's still spring. Doesn't really matter in terms of seasons when you have a temperate climate, because if you have cold weather, then it seems like the temperature is going to plummet at around 3 p.m. That is my experience from growing up in a temperate climate. I would imagine that it could even be more fierce in Nova Scotia because they get snow. So I thought it would probably be important to hone in on what the temperature was like between about 3 o'clock and heading through till midnight, because I believe that is when whatever happened with these children occurred. After the Zoom call or the face call, whichever it was, with Cindy, and before midnight. So the temperature actually goes up a little bit after 3 p.m. Not much, just a little bit. It goes up 0.3 of a degrees if you're talking Celsius. So at 3 p.m. on the Thursday, the temperature was 44 degrees Fahrenheit or 6.7 degrees Celsius. It's pretty cold. It spiked up to 7 degrees at 5 o'clock, So it was sitting around 6.7 at 3 and 4 o'clock. Then at 5 o'clock it spiked up a bit to 7 degrees. It was up there till around 6 o'clock, and then it started to plummet. So then by 7 o'clock you're back down to 6.7, 8 o'clock 6.1. By 9 o'clock it has plummeted to 4.4 degrees Celsius, 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So in the space of 3 hours, it's gotten really damn cold. But they're cold temperatures regardless. Now, it really wasn't windy, but there was a bit of wind, a bit of a breeze. Now, I would imagine that Nova Scotia, being coastal, being near the water, I would imagine that in the colder months, there'd be a bit of a bite to that. So that if you were outside and it was 7 degrees or 4 degrees, and there was just a bit of a breeze happening, a bit of a gust, then it probably would have that wind chill factor that made it feel even colder than what the actual temperature was that was being recorded. Okay, if you're still listening, thank you very much. I know this is a very long video. So before I try and pull all these threads together, I want to talk about hypothermia. Ironically, where I'm going with this is where I started 6 months ago, before we got the added confusion of Janie talking about the driveway. So hypothermia begins when the core body temperature drops below 35 degrees Celsius. I'm going to be giving this in Celsius. I didn't make notes in Fahrenheit. But basically, normal body temperature is between, I think, 36.5 and 37.5. So it's a drop below normal body temperature of 1.5 degrees minimum. So basically, when you start seeing a significant drop in body temperature, then hypothermia is an issue. Here's the thing. Young people are more at risk of hypothermia. Why? Because of high body surface area to weight. And let's be real, neither of these two children weighed very much. The pictures that we saw in the lead up to when they went missing, they both looked undernourished and underweight. Now, obviously, just going outside doesn't mean that we are going to become hypothermic. Our body has a way of compensating when we are outside in the cold. Yes, we need to rug up, because then we are going to start getting cold. But there are things that our body does to help prevent us from becoming hypothermic. The things that allow us to maintain body temperature comes from metabolism and muscle movement. This immediately puts Jack and Lily at a disadvantage. Metabolism, it seems pretty clear they weren't being properly fed. So their metabolisms would have actually been quite slow, meaning that their body wouldn't have been generating a great deal of excess heat through the metabolism process, because they wouldn't have been metabolizing quickly enough to make a difference. As for muscle movement, well, muscle mass plays a key role in that as well. A 6-year-old and a 4-year-old don't have significant muscle mass. You are looking at two children who were malnourished, potentially, probably not metabolizing overly fast, because they clearly weren't being well fed, and who, because of their age for starters, wouldn't have a great deal of muscle mass. So straight away, they are at a greater risk of hypothermia, because their body doesn't have the normal tools there. It does, but not as much as they need to maintain an adequate body temperature. I mean, even if we don't look specifically at Lily and Jack, small children have a much faster rate of heat loss than adults, partly because of the reduced muscle mass, but also because small children, their heads are proportionately larger than the rest of their body. It's just how it works when they're growing. So they're going to be losing heat through the top of their head because it is larger. If you have an environmental temperature that is lower than body temperature and your body is not adequately replacing the heat loss, then hypothermia is going to set in. In terms of when it becomes life-threatening, once the core body temperature drops below 28 degrees, that is life-threatening. And a person can become comatose once their body temperature drops below 26 degrees. Now, the length of time that it can take for someone to succumb to hypothermia varies, obviously. It depends on the temperature, it depends on their own body's ability to replace heat lost, and of course it also depends on the risk factors that I just described in terms of children being at greater risk, less muscle mass making you at greater risk, slower metabolism also putting you at greater risk. Given the risk factors, given the temperatures on Thursday afternoon going into the evening, given that it appears that Lily and Jack were quite often inadequately clothed, if they were outside with inadequate clothing, I would imagine that it would take less than 2 hours for these two children to succumb to hypothermia. So here's where I try and tie it all together. And there's a lot of thinking and logic that's gone into this, so hopefully I can get all the bits together. Starting with the discussion of the children going into the woods. In the early days, none of those three people stated to the RCMP that they believed the children had gone off into the woods. That's interesting for starters. Janie, in her statements, now she came out about 2 months into this, so we've spent the last 4 months trying to figure out what the heck Janie was talking about, because she kept saying those children would not go through the woods. But then she would turn around and say they would only ever go to the cabin up in the woods. As she's been telling us all along, and she was saying Jack doesn't go for walks. Jack will not go for walks in the woods. She's been telling us, but we hadn't actually figured out what she was saying. There's two separate things here. The going through the woods is not the going up to the cabin in the woods. That is the going for walks in the woods like she described her doing with them and the grandchildren, where she has to lift Jack over trees and stuff. Going for walks in the woods means going beyond their little fort, their little cabin. But they're quite happy going to their little cabin. That's not going through the woods. And when you look at the track that she took getting up there with Ali, you can see that you're not really going through the woods to get there. It's a track that leads to the woods, the fort, and the lean-to, whatever you want to call it, is at the edge of the woods. You're not going through the woods to get to it. So Janie, we thought she was just being confusing. She just didn't clarify what she was saying. No, they would not go through the woods, but they would go to the fort in the woods, but not go any further. Now she tries to claim that they would only go there with her grandchildren. Malaya also tried to claim this in the statement with the RCMP, which I think is a bit of plausible deniability. Well, they would go up to this fort, but they wouldn't go there on their own without the other grandchildren. So no, they didn't go up there. And yet, when Belinda asked Malaya, you know your children, where do you think they would go? What does she say? Oh, they quite often went up to this, they liked to play up there in the fort. That would be the first place to look. So that's where Belinda and her sister went first. Because that's what Malaya told them. That's where they liked to go. Daniel, up until the point when he did that interview with the turkey guy, when he just seemed to throw all caution to the wind and just come out with outright lies, up until that point, all he ever said was that he didn't think they were in the woods. He never said that he believed that they had never gone into the woods. None of them, up until when Daniel started with the lying phase with the turkey guy, ever said that they believed the children had gone into the woods or through the woods. They were very careful about the information they were giving. Malaya said she believed they may have gotten out of the house. They couldn't find them. They may have left the house. Well, of course they left the house if you can't find them. Janie did a lot of that thing where she gives you half of a statement and gets you to run with it. She gives you just enough information with the expectation that you are going to take that information and draw the conclusion that she wants you to come up with. So she said, in terms of the woods, she said Lily doesn't like bugs and things. If a fly gets on her or gets near her, she screams and runs in the house. So we were so obedient and we got the conclusion that Janie wanted us to reach. Well, if Lily doesn't like bugs, she's not going to go up to the fort. And yet Janie has already told us that Lily would go there with her grandchildren. And Malaya's telling Belinda that, yeah, they go there all the time. What Janie actually told us was that if a fly got on her or got around her, like in her face, that she would scream and run inside. Not that she wouldn't go outside because she was afraid of flies or bugs or things. I think she said if a fly got on her. So what Janie was telling us, and hoping that we would jump to the conclusion of, well, then Lily wouldn't go into the fort because she doesn't like bugs and stuff. She doesn't want to be near them. No, if they got on her, she would have a freak out. Not that's going to prevent her from going up to the fort. We know that it didn't prevent her from going up to the fort because we've heard her saying about her grandchildren. We've heard Malaya telling Belinda that's what they do. Now, it seems that when they were writing the script, they didn't have enough time to make sure they all had the same story about Lily's backpack. Malaya claims that when Lily went to bed with her backpack. Daniel says he doesn't know, can't remember seeing the backpack. He knows nothing. Janie's story is, well, Lily wasn't allowed to take that backpack outside, but Daniel was apparently constantly trying to stop her from taking it outside. And on one hand, Janie's never seen Lily with it outside. But then she adds except when my grandchildren were here. And she comes up with the story about her granddaughter filling up her backpack with treats for them to take up to the fort so they can have a little feast. And Janie gives the impression that actually that's something that Lily might do because she wants to be like Janie's granddaughter. She looks up to her. And of course, we know that Lily did model her behaviours on other people. So for her, she would have seen, this is what we do when we go play in the fort. We fill up the backpack with food. We go and have a little feast up there. This is why I said that I thought Janie went off script. Because I think she was not meant to mention this notion of taking the backpack up to the fort. And I'll double back to that in just a moment. Because the other thing we have here is Daniel talking about them taking food from the kitchen. He talks about hearing Jack rustling around in the kitchen. And then he talks about children going quiet and that they were possibly in the kitchen getting food or something like that. He was specifically doing that. You know, kids are up to something when they go quiet. Here's an example of something they shouldn't be doing, stealing food from the kitchen. That is exactly what he meant. Now, I just want to point something out. Malaya is introducing this idea of Lily taking her backpack to bed. Now, I know little kids will have some really odd quirks that as adults we think, why do you do that? So it's not beyond the realms of possibility for a child to decide they really like that particular backpack and take it to bed with them. Now, Lily's backpack is a corduroy backpack, so it is going to be softer. It's not going to be quite as rigid as like a school backpack. And corduroy, yeah, that is kind of soft. I don't think Lily would have taken that backpack to bed with her. Now, you may have been wondering why I seem to be using the same images over and over in these two videos, the previous one and this one. There was a reason for that. I was giving you images of Lily with all her dolls and also images of Lily hugging Jack. We've seen the birthday video where Lily is screaming. Lily has sensory issues. She gets sensory overload, which is when you get the screaming happening. But she's clearly a very huggy kind of girl. There are so many photos of her hugging Jack. But aside from that, Lily loved her dolls. She had so many dolls, clearly. And we've heard that she would just get into her little bubble playing with her dolls. So, in terms of taking things to bed with her, I think, for starters, Lily would have been more likely to have taken a soft toy with her. That's what you would expect for a child who has sensory issues. Not a backpack that's going to have zips on it, that's not overly huggable. I think based on what we know of Lily, she would have taken something to bed that was huggable. So, one of her soft toys, or maybe a doll that was especially huggable. Not a backpack. So, I don't know why Malaya is trying to establish this idea of Lily taking her backpack to bed with her, because it's not logical to me. A little girl with sensory issues is going to want something more substantial and more comforting than a backpack. Something that is soft and huggable. To me, it seems far more likely that Lily would have taken one of her dolls to bed with her, or a soft toy. not a corduroy backpack. I think that in Malaya's mind, like I said, for starters, I don't think that they figured out that part of the script in terms of how to explain Lily's backpack. I think the notion was to just say Lily's backpack was missing, and they weren't expecting further questions about the backpack. So I think when questioned, this is when the story of, oh, well, Lily sleeps with it came into play. I think in Malaya's head, she probably thought that would explain why the backpack was missing. But actually it doesn't, because according to Malaya's story, the children didn't just get up out of bed and head off out through the sliding door. They got up out of bed and they were playing in their room for an extended amount of time before they vanished. So while Malaya is trying to establish the notion that the reason the backpack is missing was because Lily had it with her because she sleeps with it, she's missing out the part where actually she said the children were playing. So if they're playing and they decide to go outside and play, why is Lily suddenly going to think of going in, grabbing her backpack and taking it with her just to play out in the yard? Because that's the other thing that Malaya says. She said, oh, you know, we could... Janie said they were playing out in the yard for a while. Now, the sliding door is significant. It is something that is mentioned by all three of them and something that they work hard on to establish a narrative around. At the base of what they are saying, the key argument that they are making from talking about this sliding door is that they didn't know the children were outside. That at least is Malaya and Daniel's argument. Janie's argument is, well, she just thought the children were outside playing. She clearly had no idea that Daniel and Malaya didn't know they were outside playing. And, well, you know, she drifted off to sleep and then it was all quiet. But she still is supporting the sliding door story. She had Ali from CBC there and she got her to open and close the door to prove how silent it was. So a key point in their narrative for all of them is to establish the fact that they have nothing, they didn't know that the children got out. They had no idea. But what is interesting is the way that Daniel and Malaya's statements are almost identical in terms of the door was shut, but the children don't normally shut the door. And that was something that to me was a red flag from day one. And then to hear this interview with the turkey guy, where Daniel is actually quite negative about it. Essentially, you know, they just need to make that effort to shut the door. It showed that it is a bone of contention. In one of her interviews with RCMP, Malaya offered essentially an explanation, an apology for the children not shutting the door. It's not really their fault, the door's heavy. So on one hand, you have Daniel showing us that, hey, it really ticks him off that they're not trying hard enough to make sure that door is closed. Malaya seems like her explanation was, it's difficult for them. Now, in terms of Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening, we know they got home around 3:30ish, and they did do a Zoom call with Cindy, apparently. Now, I don't know enough to say how truthful Cindy would be with the RCMP in terms of were the children there when that call was made. Meanwhile, we have Janie talking about being outside, working on her fence, raking gravel, and the children were outside playing. She talks about Daniel coming in helping her out. And then she went in for supper. But she doesn't know what time the children went inside. She doesn't say specifically she went inside for supper and the children were outside still. She doesn't say she could still hear them for an extended amount of time or anything. She just says she doesn't know when they went inside. Malaya, when she's talking about Thursday night, can't remember whether the children went outside or not. But hey, they were definitely in by dark. Daniel doesn't even mention the children. To me, that is significant. Because if he was outside helping Janie with the fence, as she claims, you'd think he would have noticed the children as well. Janie offers up that unnecessary bit of information when she says she doesn't know when the children went inside and says, I don't know when they went to bed. Why would she know when they went to bed normally? Because she doesn't live in that house and she has said, what goes on in that house has got nothing to do with me. So it is odd for her to offer that up. I don't know what time they went to bed. Because it's not something that is relevant for her, because she wouldn't know, she shouldn't know. And yet she offered that up. Malaya, she's confused about when the children went to bed. Maybe 10 o'clock, maybe 9 o'clock. Who knows? Daniel, again, utterly clueless. Now, I've said a few times that I thought that it was a bit of leakage when Janie said if two kids get out into the driveway, you'd hear Lily going, come on, Jackie, let's go, Jackie. And of course, a lot of Janie's narrative seems to point to the possibility that the children were in the driveway at some point in time. When Janie's doing her interview, she points down the driveway as she's talking about if two kids get out. Now, I took that originally as meaning something must have happened in the driveway. But to get up to that fort, they have to go down the driveway and then you go up the path where that old broken down car is. So Janie indicating down the driveway could be indicating going down the driveway and then heading up to the fort. The other thing that we get from Janie, which I think she was probably not meant to say, was her talking about hearing Daniel yelling. And originally she said she thought he was yelling to call them inside. But then she actually dumps him in at big time and she talks about, well, he could have been yelling at Jack because Jack gets into things. Jack lets the chickens out. Jack gets into trouble. So if we try and strip away all the excess narrative, here is the basic information that we have been given. The basic information is that those children at some point in time exited that house by their own choice. Normally, when the children go outside, they don't shut that sliding door. And yet, at some point in time, that sliding door got closed. They have not said, nobody has said, the children themselves closed that door. Janie introduced the idea or the possibility or almost reality of Daniel yelling at the kids. Daniel tells us about the kids raiding the cupboard, which is clearly something they're not meant to do. Janie talks about Lily wanting to be like her granddaughter and wanting to fill up her backpack with treats so they can go up to the little fort. So here's one possibility that all these things point towards. When they came home on Thursday, we know Malaya was tired. She mentioned that, and she said that she didn't even get their clothes, unpack their clothes. And that's 24 hours after them going and doing the clothes washing. Malaya tries to avoid the topic of the children going outside to play, which is interesting. But Janie says they did. So I'm going into hypothetical mode now, based on all the information we have. Because Malaya was tired, she probably wasn't paying attention to what Lily and Jack were doing. Janie was outside waiting for Daniel to finish getting his tools, which I suspect that's not exactly what he was doing. So Daniel was possibly absent in some regard or another. I believe with Daniel being somewhat absent, Lily and Jack took that as an opportunity to get Lily's backpack, put some treats in it, so they could go up to the fort and have their own little feast up at the fort. They went out through the sliding door and they did not shut it. I think Daniel got annoyed because they did not shut that sliding door. It is a bone of contention. You've heard that in the way that both Malaya and Daniel spoke. We've heard that Daniel can be a bit extreme with the children. Both have had more than their fair share of black eyes. Janie has put her foot in it and told us that Daniel yells at the children. Daniel's children said that Malaya locks them in their room. Most significantly, there is a CPS file on those children that is significant enough that after they went missing, the minister wanted to see their file, and there is some sort of investigation into the handling of these two children's CPS file. That should tell you that there are serious issues here in terms of the well-being and the safety of these children. We had those allegations that were made by Wade's daughter. And something like that, where there's smoke, there's fire. Daniel claims there's no cupboards in the trailer, but he hasn't provided any photos to show us that's the truth. He's actually gone kind of quiet since then. Latest is him turning around and trying to make it sound like Malaya became kind of rough and aggressive with the children. So he's suddenly going into panic mode and blaming Malaya. So what you tend to see a lot of the time in these kinds of relationships where you have a step parent who can be harsh with their behaviour management, you do see them going over the top in reacting to things, over punishing. So here's a possibility. Like I said, Daniel and Malaya both said the sliding door was closed. They did not say Lily and Jack closed it. We've been told that the front door was essentially disabled. It was either locked or had a wrench jammed in it or something. And in ripping it open, Daniel damaged the door somehow. So Daniel was in a foul mood over something. Did he lock the children out because they left that door open just one time too many? Did he discover that they had grabbed some treats from the kitchen, gone out to have a little feast up at the cabins, up at the fort, and he decided to teach them a lesson and close that sliding door and lock them out? This would explain why nobody seems to know what time they went inside on Thursday night. This would explain why nobody really knows exactly what time they went to bed Thursday night. This would explain Janie's story about them getting out into the driveway, her insistence on being so adamant that they did not go through the woods. Because what she's really telling us here is, no, they went up to their fort. And she has essentially told us that. She has leaked that in so many ways. Even down to the talking about Lily and the backpack and wanting to emulate her granddaughter. And that is backed up with Daniel talking about the children essentially stealing food from the kitchen just before they went missing. Daniel has spent 2 years or more undermining Malaya, destroying her confidence in herself as a parent. So if he said, we're locking the door, they can stay outside till I say they can come in, Malaya's not going to argue with that. Because in her mind, it's her fault that they went out and they didn't shut the door behind them. It's her fault that they took snacks from the cupboard. She's not going to argue it. Is this why the thought of them not being in their beds is so triggering for Malaya? Because that night they should have been in their beds but they were locked outside. Is this why Malaya said Lily went to bed with her backpack? In his statement to the RCMP, Daniel talks about checking on the children before he went to bed. But when he's talking with the turkey guy, when he's feeling relaxed, feeling quite confident, thinking he's doing a pretty damn good job there, he says he flicked on the light for the kids. When you go in and check on children at night, you're not going to turn on the light, for starters. But if they were sound asleep, why would you flick the light on for them? For them implies they needed you to turn it on. Did he flick on the light on the decking outside the sliding door at midnight? Were they left outside in the dark all that time, perhaps? And he decided to flick the light on and let them come inside. They'd been outside long enough. Did they maybe, when they realised they were locked out, go up to their safe space, up in that fort? Daniel says he didn't see what the children were wearing because the blankets were up on them. And in one of his 2 retellings of running up to the cabin in the woods, he says he ran up there but he couldn't see them. Well, let's say, like I said, they left the door open. Daniel decided to teach them a lesson and shut them out. Maybe Malaya pointed out that it was cold and he threw a couple of blankets out to them. They went up to the fort because that was a safe, quiet place. And the reason Daniel didn't see them when he went up there was because they were lying on the ground under the blankets. These are little children. If you went up in the woods in the dark and they were just lying on the ground under blankets, no, you probably wouldn't see them at first. This, of course, is all hypothetical. But basically, the crux of this, did Daniel lock these children outside because they left that sliding door open? And because the temperature that night was already down to 7 at 6 p.m. By 9 p.m. it was 4 degrees. Did they succumb to hypothermia because they were locked outside? Because of an innocent mistake of leaving that sliding door open? because it was too heavy for them. I had considered that maybe something happened specifically in the driveway. Maybe they were hit by a car. But it would be very unfortunate and very, very rare for a driveway accident to result in both children becoming deceased. You may get one deceased and one seriously injured, but both, that would be a really bad stroke of luck. Hypothermia, on the other hand, those children were underfed, they were underclothed. If they were locked outside, it would have only taken a couple of hours. This is possibly one of the longest straight through videos that I've recorded, but I thought I was already at that point after an hour where it seemed like I just needed to go through to the conclusion. I'm really interested to know your thoughts on this theory. And that's all this is. This is a theory based on months of statement analysis, the changing stories from Daniel, and looking at the consistencies in these stories. But it's still a theory. So I'm going to leave it at that. I will try this week to put all this together without all the clips and everything, just into a condensed video where I'm just basically explaining it through. And that way I can also address any observations that are made by you guys. I can address any issues that with the theory that maybe don't work, and just pull it together a bit more clearly. So on that note, if you're still here, first of all, congratulations for lasting through a very, very long video. But also, thank you so much for listening. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe. Also, please hit that like button. Get this video out there into the algorithm so more people are going to see it. Also, please leave a comment. I really want to know your thoughts on what I've discussed in these two videos. So on that note, thank you, and I'll catch you in the next one.